Switching to China, as we indicated we would, my executive producer, Chris Leonard, found this for you. This is one of the world's greatest self-proclaimed experts on China from a number of years ago.
Let's understand how Mao and Zhou Enlai looked at China in 1972, at the time this new relationship with the United States took place. Why is it that Mao was to say that he liked right-wing governments? Because right-wing governments were the very antithesis of what he stood for. The answer is that as far as the Chinese are concerned, their primary interest is China, always China. That's number one. Their secondary interest is philosophy. It doesn't mean that Mao Zedong was not a very dedicated Marxist communist, call him what you want. And the same is true of Zhou Enlai. But where there is conflict between the ideology and their security comes first.
What is the current relationship of the United States to China? Can you understand what the Biden administration understands about China, its willingness to trade with us, its danger from the intemperate use of its military? What's your big picture take on this?
If I could
just comment on Nixon as you see fit, Professor.
Yeah, let me make 2 quick points about Nixon. First of all, it shows you how smart Nixon was when it came to foreign policy. And the second point I'd make about Nixon is that his comment about the relationship between ideology and security is music to my ears. States always privilege their own security. And if that means that they have to cachet their ideology, they'll do that, because security or survival is always number one. And that's what Nixon is saying is how the Chinese think about the world. That is how the Chinese think about the world. The Chinese are realists to the core. I often tell people that when I go to China, I start my talks by saying it's good to be back among my people, because the Chinese are realists, right? And what the Chinese want to do, and it makes perfect strategic sense from their point of view, is they want to dominate Asia the way we dominate the Western Hemisphere. We have a Monroe Doctrine. We don't like distant great powers in our backyard. They don't like the United States on their doorstep. It makes perfect sense from their point of view. They want to dominate Asia. But the United States has no intention of allowing them to dominate Asia. And this competition that is now set in has an economic dimension, surrounds mainly high technologies or cutting edge technologies, and it has a military dimension. We're bent on containing China militarily. This competition between them and us is not going to go away anytime soon.
I want to use a word that you use a lot in your writings and in your speeches, hegemony. We have had hegemony in the West. They want hegemony in the East. Are they a danger to us? Is their hegemony, their dominance, their regional dominance in the East a danger to the national security of the United States? Now, I wouldn't ask Lindsey Graham that question. He'd say yes before I finish the question.
Well, Lindsey Graham would see any country on earth that he didn't like as a threat to us and want to go to war against it.
Right. I want to start the war against it.
Yes. But no, the United States has a profound interest in making sure that it is the only regional hegemon on the planet. We do not want another state that dominates its region like we dominate the Western Hemisphere. And in the 20th century, we played a key role in putting 4 countries that were pursuing regional hegemony on the scrap heap of history: Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union. The United States does not tolerate peer competitors or peer regional hegemons. The historical record is very clear. We want to be the only regional hegemon, and we want to have power projection capability all across the globe. The last thing we want is for China to dominate Asia so that it is free to roam around the globe with its military forces the way we roam around the globe. Most Americans don't realize this, but the reason that the United States is free to roam around the planet and cause trouble in every nook and cranny of the world is because it is a regional hegemon. We have no threats in our region, so we can move around the globe. We don't want the Chinese to be so powerful in Asia that they're free to roam into places like the Persian Gulf or, God forbid, the Western Hemisphere. So we go to great lengths to maintain a balance of power in Asia, as we have done throughout the 20th century.
Is China a military threat to the United States? Or stated differently, do you see in the future the inevitability, Professor Mearsheimer, graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point, the likelihood, probability of military conflict between China and the United States?
I think it's inevitable that we're going to have, and in fact, we're having it right now, an intense security competition. How likely it is that we will have a war is impossible to say. You can't predict whether or not this security competition will lead to war. As you know, during the Cold War, we had an intense security competition that almost led to war in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. But thankfully, we never had a great power war involving the United States and the Soviet Union. One hopes that will be the case with regard to the United States and China. The reason to worry more about the situation today than we worried about it during the Cold War is that it's easy to imagine a limited war breaking out over the South China Sea or the East China Sea or over Taiwan. During the Cold War, the scenario that we focused on was Central Europe. And the truth is, because a war in Central Europe would have been so absolutely horrible, right? It probably would have escalated quickly to the nuclear level. It was hard to imagine a war getting started. We couldn't imagine either the Soviets or the Americans attacking each other in Central Europe. But if you think about China and the United States and where the battles or where the war would take place, it's basically out in the water or involves islands, little islands in the South China Sea, or a big island called Taiwan. But we're not talking about a war on Chinese territory. We're not talking about a war on the Asian mainland. And therefore, war becomes more thinkable today than it was during the Cold War. But again, this is not to say we are going to have a war with China, because I would not predict that with any degree of certainty. It's just a serious possibility.
If Joe Biden, strike that, if Tony Blinken called you up tonight and said, give me some guidance, Professor Mearsheimer, are the Chinese a material threat to the national security of the United States of America? I'm going to guess you could answer that with one word.
Yes. Yes.
The answer is yes.
Yes.
How are they a material threat to the national security of the United States?
Because if they develop significant military capability and they dominate all of Asia, then they can move into the Western Hemisphere the same way we have moved into East Asia. You want to remember, we're right on their doorstep because we're a regional hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. We have military forces right in their face, and they don't like that. This is the same logic that applies with regard to NATO expansion up to Russia's borders. Great powers do not like rival great powers in their backyard.
But if we're in their backyard.
Of course we are, but we're the United States. And as the United States,
we're the indispensable empire that can go wherever it wants.
No, I wouldn't go that far because, as you know, I'm not interested in fighting wars here, there, and everywhere. My principal point to you is that the United States should go to great lengths to prevent China from becoming a regional hegemon. I would have pulled out of Europe when the Cold War ended. I argued for disbanding NATO and leaving Europe because there was no potential hegemon. I was not in favor of the Iraq War or any of these other crazy wars that we have been fighting.
But would you be in favor of picking a fight with China?
Absolutely not. I don't like your rhetoric, which is, says picking a fight. I don't want to pick a fight. And in
Okay,
fact,
good.
going back to your point about Tony Blinken calling me on the telephone, I would tell Tony Blinken that he should go to great lengths to develop a serious capability to contain China, but not do anything to provoke China and cause a war. So I don't want to pick a fight. I just want to contain China, much the way we contained the Soviet Union during the Cold War.
If China surrounds Taiwan with a massive military fleet all aimed at the island, what, if anything, should we do?
Well, the question, I think, really is whether or not they would try to invade Taiwan. That's the scenario we really worry about. And I think it's unlikely that they will do that. But your question is, what should we do if...
Right, if an invasion is imminent.
Yes, exactly. We will go to the defense of Taiwan axiomatically, because Taiwan is an important strategic asset that we cannot afford to lose to China for two reasons. The first reason is, if we abandon Taiwan, if we did not defend Taiwan, this would have a devastating effect on our alliance structures in East Asia. The Japanese, the South Koreans, the Filipinos, the Australians, nobody would be able to trust the United States to defend them because we didn't defend Taiwan. So that's the first reason we'll defend Taiwan. The second reason is, if you're interested in bottling up the Chinese Navy and Air Force inside the first island chain, that means not letting them get out into the Pacific Ocean, right? The way to do it is to control Taiwan. If you lose Taiwan, their ability to project power, China's ability to project power out into the waters of the Western Pacific goes up significantly. And we don't want that to happen. And this is why, by the way, Joe Biden has said 4 separate times that we would defend Taiwan. And each time he said it, the White House walked it back. But I don't think this is a case of Joe Biden's brain slipping out of gear. I think this was done intentionally to send a signal to the Chinese that we would defend Taiwan. And by the way, Judge, my experience talking to Chinese elites is that they understand we will defend Taiwan. And I think that, by the way, makes a war less likely.
Agreed. Is such a defense even feasible, given the distance between the United States and Taiwan, and what we would have to do logistically to get manpower and equipment there in the face of the Chinese Air Force and Navy?
2 points. Don't forget, as we were talking about before, we're already there. As you pointed out, we're already on the doorstep.
Yeah, one of our 903 foreign military installations is somewhere over there.
Yes. But the second point I would make to you, and this is a very important point. China, to get to Taiwan, has to launch an amphibious operation. They have to come across water. And that is one of the most difficult and taxing military operations you can imagine. And this is a military that has not fought a war since 1979. I mean, the United States military is fighting wars all the time. So it's like a cocked pistol, right? War is our business and business is good. But the Chinese have not fought a war since 1979. So you're talking about a military that's quite rusty, doesn't have a lot of battle experience, and you're asking it to launch an amphibious operation across a body of water that is quite large, land on the beaches of Taiwan and secure the island. I think that's extremely hard to do. And the Americans will be there. And by the way, the Japanese will be there as well, because the Japanese care more about keeping Taiwan out of China's hands than we care about it. So the Chinese will run into real resistance. And I think the likelihood of success, we're talking now about an amphibious operation against Taiwan, I think is very low.
Here's another reason you might get that phone call from Tony Blinken. Watch the look on his face as his boss spoke. Tell me if this is good diplomacy between the United States and China for the President of the United States to say this.
Mr. President, after today, would you still refer to President Xi as a dictator? This is a term that you used earlier this year.
Well, look, he is. I mean, he's a dictator in the sense that he is the guy who runs a country that is a communist country that is based on a form of government totally different than ours.
Tony Blinken called John Mearsheimer. What do we do about this?
I don't think there's anything you can do about it because it's, I believe, hard to talk common sense to President Biden about these sorts
I mean,
of
this was in San Francisco, and President Xi was still there. He wasn't in the room, but he was still in the United States, in California, when President Biden said that.
Look, President Biden has once before called Xi a dictator, and it drove the Chinese crazy. And Blinken is a smart enough guy to understand that it makes no sense to call him a dictator again, especially after you had a meeting with him where you were trying to patch up your relations. But Biden just went out and called him a dictator again. And as you say, when Xi was still in San Francisco, and Blinken, for understandable reasons, looked disgusted. I mean, he couldn't believe it. And who can blame Blinken, right? He just should not have done that.
What is your understanding, Professor Mearsheimer, of any agreements that were finalized or formalized? We all know they're made in advance by a different level of a governmental official between President Biden and President Xi in San Francisco this week.
Well, I think this was mainly an opportunity for the two sides to get together and cool down tensions. And I think it was in Xi's interest to do that. He has a lot of trouble on the home front. And I think it's in Joe Biden's interest because we're in deep trouble in Ukraine. We're in deep trouble in the Middle East. And the last thing we need is a major league crisis in East Asia. So I think both leaders had an interest in getting together and being nice to each other. And that's really what this was about. I think to the extent that you got a meaningful agreement, I was glad to see that they made significant progress on opening communications between the two sides at the military level. Because I think one of the great dangers here, you talk about the possibility of war between the United States and China. I think one of the real possibilities involves the South China Sea, and it involves an accident, two planes crashing into each other, a Chinese plane and an American plane, or some sort of crisis that breaks out between the Philippines and the Chinese over naval supplies for that little island that the Philippines claim and the Chinese also claim, and then that escalates and we get involved, ... We don't want that to happen. Having, open military channels where the two sides are communicating is, I think, all for the good.
Do you know or do you suspect that the Chinese were furious when Joe Biden used the word dictator? I mean, can you imagine if President Xi told a journalist from Beijing, I just spent 3 days with President Biden, and his mental incompetence was quite apparent to me.
Well, I think the Chinese are sophisticated enough to figure out what they're dealing with when it comes to Joe Biden. I think they understand full well, as Tony Blinken did Joe Biden put his foot in his mouth? And
Yes.
I think publicly they're going to protest and make it clear that they do not like Joe Biden calling Xi Jinping a dictator again. But I think that privately, they probably are writing this off as just more evidence that Joe Biden is not playing with a full deck.
Got it. With Thanksgiving next week, we have a short week. We'd love to try and squeeze you in. If not, we'll see you the week after. You're a fan favorite. You're a personal favorite of mine. We all learn every time we listen to you, Professor Mearsheimer.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Sure. All the best to you. Thank you very much.